Okay, hi, my name is Maria Bloyer and welcome. We're going to have a quick training tonight about school discipline, and we're really going to focus on what DC families need to know. Hopefully, this will be helpful and informative to you, and I'll get you out of here pretty quickly. Okay. And like I said, my name is Maria Bloyer. I'm one of the attorneys at Advocates for Justice in Education. We are the District of Columbia's Parent Training and Information Center. I just want to give you a quick roadmap for tonight. What we're going to do is first, we're going to talk a little bit about the law. We'll start with the right to a public education and the right to due process of law. And then we'll do a little bit more law and talk about the Student Fair Access to School Act. Finally, we'll talk about some differences between DCPS and charter schools. And then I'll tell you when you can call AJE and when you might want to call AJE when there's, red flags. But I also want to remind folks that we are available for them whenever. And you're always welcome to call. The number is still 202-678-8060. Again, that's 202-678-8060. And despite the pandemic, we are, answering calls and look forward to talking with you. Right. So jumping right in, the right to a public education. People talk a lot about this, and I think it's important to remember that students are entitled to a meaningful education. And in DC, that right is for students who are age 5 to 18. They have, the district has a compulsory education law, and you have a right to an education, period, full stop. And like any other right that we have, any other right that we have, you, before that right can be taken away, you're afforded what's called due process, due process. And due process is kind of exactly what it sounds like, but it's really how the law talks about fairness, right? And the thing to remember is that in the education context, when we're suspending kids or removing them from school somehow, we are denying them access to something they have a right to. So there has to be due process, and that's a constitutional right. And at its core, due process has two parts to it, and those two parts are notice of the charges. Okay, so that's step one, notice of the charges. You've got to, know why maybe you're being removed from school, and you have to have an opportunity to be heard. That's an opportunity to tell your side of the story, to, explain what happened. So those are the two parts, the notice of the charges. So you've got to know, why am I being told I can't come to school? And you have to have an opportunity to tell your side. And we usually see this in hearings. That's usually how due process is manifest, how it happens. It happens in a hearing, but not all the time. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And generally, these things should happen before a student is removed from school, unless there are, extreme or emergency conditions. All right. So, moment of geekiness here. Students' entitlement to public education, is a property interest. And that's something that the Supreme Court has been really clear about, that kids have a property interest. And there's also a liberty interest and a reputational interest. And those interests of students are protected by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And the 14th Amendment specifically says that a state, and DC is a state for the purposes of this conversation, can't deprive any person, including a child, of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And in the District of Columbia, the 14th Amendment due process protections are applicable through the due process clause of the 5th Amendment. I promise this is the geekiest I will get and the most law jargon you'll hear the whole night. But I just like people to really have a foundation in why this is important and why it's a constitutional issue and why it's a 14th Amendment issue. And these laws, this constitutional framework, it protects all public school students. So DCPS students and charter school students. right? And that's kind of why I like to start this conversation talking about the Constitution, because I don't think anyone's going to say the Constitution doesn't apply to me because I go to a charter school, right? Um, so I always like to help people kind of remember that. Now, DCPS and each public charter school have different policies and procedures, and that's allowed and that's permissible. But again, the constitutional protections apply to students, all students equally, and as does the Student Fair Access to School Act. Now, that's the other law we're going to talk about tonight in a little bit more detail. But I just want to remind folks that all of the laws apply to both DCPS and to charter schools. Okay, all right. So the Student Fair Access to School Act. This is probably one of my favorite laws right now. And it sets real limits on all public schools' abilities to use suspensions, expulsions as a means of, managing student behavior. And it also defines involuntary transfers as a disciplinary consequence, and it puts limits on in-school suspensions. So it's a very comprehensive law. We're not going to go into all of it, but we are going to hit some of the high points that most families need to know. So the first thing I want people to know is that schools can't use out-of-school suspensions, expulsions, or involuntary transfers for unexcused absences or late arrivals. We don't tell kids they can't come to school because they were late to school. Okay. Now, students can be unenrolled after accumulating 20 or more consecutive full day unexcused absences, but there's still a due process requirement there. Those are still, you still need notice, and you still need to have an opportunity to respond. We're seeing most of those 20-day unenrollments right now happening because of people maybe not attending school because of COVID. Okay, so two of the other things that I'm most excited about that the Student Fair Access to School Act does is it limited the use of out-of-school suspension to 5 days per incident for students in grades K through 5. Okay, this means that every kiddo who's in grades K through 5 should not have more than 5 days of out-of-school suspension for one incident. Okay. And out-of-school suspension is limited to no more than 10 days for our other students, no more than 10 days. Okay. Now, there is another law in the District of Columbia that says preschool students cannot be suspended or expelled. Okay. I want to reiterate that. Preschool students cannot be suspended or expelled for disciplinary matters. Really important. I know those pre-K spots are hard to come by. So I want folks to keep that in mind and know that there is a law in the District of Columbia that specifically says we're not going to be suspending pre-K kiddos. All right. All right. Some more information about the Student Fair Access to School Act. Suspensions that are for more than 6 days or more than 6 days, are by function of law automatically deemed to be long-term suspensions, and the student is automatically entitled to a hearing. Okay, and the student's entitled to a hearing. This is really important. One of the Supreme Court cases that was kind of interpreting the student's due process rights had previously defined that 10 days was probably long-term, and that's when the right to a hearing attached. Well, the district, by act of council, said, well, in the district, you get a hearing after 6 days. Okay, and that's important because generally you can't be removed from school until you have your hearing. Okay, so you get to exercise your due process, and the hearing is how the due process happens, right? And suspensions generally need to happen before a student can be expelled or suspended. Now, I like to flag that because one, that's part of the reason why it's kind of important that you give us a call if you have a hearing coming up. And two, if you do have a hearing coming up, unless there's an extenuating circumstance or there's a school safety issue or something, fairly extreme, your kiddo needs to be in school while we're waiting for that hearing to happen. All right. The other thing that I think is really important to know is that schools can't require parents to participate in a conference or another re-entry meeting before the student returns to school. This was a huge problem for a long time. Students would have their out of school suspension. They're losing learning the whole time they're out of school. And then it's time to return to school. And now they're not allowed to come back to school unless there's a parent who's able to sit down and have a meeting with the school. So the suspension winds up sometimes being several days longer just because parents have to work. Or, parents can't be at the school when the school wants the parent to be there. So this makes it really clear that the school can't make the return to the class, return to education, return to classes contingent on a parent's ability to come attend a meeting. Another thing that schools cannot do is they can't suspend students for attendance related issues. We already talked about that. And something else they have to do is really be intentional and limit the educational impact of school removal. Okay, so there can't be any automatic failures because you missed X number of days because of a failure, because of a disciplinary matter. There can't be a refusal to allow a student to make up a test or anything like that. There is not supposed to be any educational impact for school removal. Okay, and that's if kiddos are out of school for more than 2 days. So any disciplinary action that goes on for more than 2 days, this student should have an educational continuity plan. All right. And then finally, I always really want to remind folks that, whatever school you go to, a DCPS school or a charter school, their discipline policies should be readily available to you. You should know where they are and they should be publicly available. Typically for most charter schools, that's going to be on the school's website. If you can't find it, you can look at the PCSB's Transparency Hub. You might be able to find it there. And if you can't find it there either, go ahead and give us a call and we can help you out with that. DCPS's disciplinary rules are found in Chapter 25 of the DC Municipal Code. Okay, and we have that link on our website, but also on DCPS's website. But let's talk a little bit more about the differences between DCPS and charter, and then we'll talk more about Chapter 25. So, as a reminder, again, federal law, US Constitution, they apply equally to DCPS and charter schools. All of the relevant health, safety, child welfare, and civil rights laws apply equally to both. And the Student Fair Access to School Act applies equally to both charter schools and DCPS. Like I said, they both have to have discipline policies that are publicly available and accessible. And those policies have to comply with the Student Fair Access to School Act, which means they have to feature alternatives to school removal and feature tiers in their response to student behavior. So they're not allowed to, have, zero tolerance policies. And, you make one mistake and you're out, that kind of thing. There has to be a tiered response. Now, I like to remind people of this, that both DCPS and charter schools must be able to show some jurisdiction in order to discipline a student. So the behavior either needs to happen at school or at a school-related event, or have some kind of significant nexus to the school. There was a Supreme Court case about it this year. It's very exciting. We don't get a lot of Supreme Court cases in education law, but it was a cheerleader case. I think a lot of you probably heard about it. But there has to be a nexus, okay? There's got to be a nexus, and there has to be some kind of demonstration that the student's behavior that the school is trying to suspend them for had an impact on the school and it was substantial. Okay, it can't just be, it was inappropriate. It has to be a substantial impact on the school day. Okay, all right. So Chapter 25. First, I want to tell folks this. If you're listening to this and you think, oh, okay, well, I'll go look at Chapter 25. Chapter 25 needs to be updated. Okay. Chapter 25 needs to be updated. The Student Fair Access to School Act was passed a couple of years ago, and Chapter 25 hasn't been updated to reflect the passage of the new law yet. So whenever you're looking at Chapter 25 or a handbook from BCPS, just note and remember that if you see a difference between what's in Chapter 25 and what the Student Fair Access to School Act says, remember that the Student Fair Access to School Act applies, okay? On their website, DCPS has a crosswalk kind of explaining how these two things interact right now. But again, like I said, it's gonna be the Student Fair Access to School Act. DCPS is still using this tiered communication system with families for how they talk about school discipline and student behavior. So tier 1, insubordination, minor disruptions, those should not result in any kind of out of school discipline. Disruption damage to school property, minor harm to self, others. Those typically and usually should not result in removal from school. It might in some circumstances, but if again, for children under grade 5, can't result in more than 5 days per incident, and can't be more than 10 days per incident for children over grade 5, and for children also over grade 5, if the suspension itself is for more than 6 days, they're entitled to a hearing. Okay, DCPS has their hearings at the Office of Administrative Hearings. Okay, and those hearings are presided over by an administrative law judge. Okay. All right. The other tiers, significant disruption, harm to self, others, significant disruption, destruction of property, significant harm to others, and then possession of illegal materials, significant disruption, substantial harm. Oftentimes we're going to be looking at an out-of-school suspension for those, but not always. And there's definitely a preference in the law for keeping kids in school and learning. Okay. But like I said, please remember, after 6 days, the kiddo is entitled to a hearing, and in DCPS, that hearing is held at the Office of Administrative Hearings. And it's presided over by an ALJ, an administrative law judge. Now, in the charter sector, it's very, very different. Okay. All DCPS schools comply with the same set of rules. So there's a little bit more predictability. Every charter school in the District of Columbia is allowed to have its own discipline policy. And they're different, just like all of the charter schools are different. And they include different appeal rights and, different rules about who is running the hearing, how does the hearing go, what kind of evidence can be introduced at hearing. So there's a lot of rules that are different. So I always recommend to families, whenever they have a student in a charter school and there's a disciplinary matter, the first thing I tell folks is please, please, please get that handbook and read it and look at it. Really spend some time with that handbook, because the rules are different at every single charter school. And that handbook should be available to you on the student's website, on the school's website. If it's not, you should be able to find it on the PCSB's Transparency Hub. And if neither of those two things work, give us a call and we can help you find that handbook. But it's really important, because otherwise you don't know what the rules are, right? And that's something you need to know. All right. Generally speaking, DCPS Chapter 25 does not apply to charter schools unless, the school has adopted it and they say they're going to do that. I am not aware of any charter school that has decided they want to adopt DCPS's policies. But again, the rules about due process of law, due process procedures, the right to notice in a hearing, these still apply to students at charter schools, as does the Student Fair Access to School and any other law that impacts the civil rights of students. Okay. And also, I think it's important to remember that for students with disabilities, who HAE, obviously serves a lot of students with disabilities, all of those special protections that are designed under IDEA to make sure that students with disabilities aren't being disciplined because of their disability. Okay. All of those protections apply equally to kids in charter schools and kids at DCPS. Okay. So when should you call us? Well, you should call us whenever your student is being removed from class or school and you don't think it's fair or right. Okay. I always tell folks, most of us know when something's not fair, right? And most of us know when there's an issue, even if we can't quite put our finger on it. So if there's something going on that you don't think is fair or right or appropriate, go ahead and call. And I also want to just highlight a couple of things that I think parents should also be looking out for. You might want to think about reaching out to us or someone else whenever those removals or suspensions or disciplinary occurrences show a pattern, right? Because that might mean something else is going on. You also might want to reach out if your student is facing school exclusion and they have a disability, or you think they might have a disability. Okay. And again, the law doesn't require that parents know everything. So if you just think something might be going on, that's enough. That's enough to suspect there might be a disability. There might be something else going on. And that's worth giving us a call, if only just to work through things. Okay. Please do call if your student was ever restrained or secluded at school. Um, restrained or secluded. That's, when students are prevented from moving their body by adults, or secluded is, when they're removed from their peers. Please do give us a call if that happens to your student. Both restraint and seclusion are harmful and have real impact on kids. And you want to have a conversation about what's going on if your student is experiencing restraint and seclusion, especially if they're experiencing repeated restraint or seclusion. Please obviously give us a call if a student was hit or ever threatened at school or made to feel unsafe by adults in the building. Another time to give us a call is when you have a hearing. If there's a disciplinary hearing, please do give us a call. Depending on the timing and our capacity, we may or may not be able to represent you at that hearing, but we can definitely give you some advice, counsel, information, help you prepare for that hearing. So if you have a hearing, please call sooner rather than later. And also, please call if your student is out of school. Okay, if your student isn't in school or has been denied access to school, that's a great time to call us, and we can problem solve and explore what needs to happen to get them back into school. And then finally, if you have a meeting with the school to explore the relationship between a student's disability and some kind of behavior, typically these meetings are called manifestation determination reviews, although schools don't always use that exact language, or MDR, manifestation determination review. But if there is that, those meetings can be complicated and a little bit tricky because you're trying to figure out the relationship between, some behavior that might otherwise be subject to disciplinary action and your student's disability. So if you have a meeting like that coming up, or if you have concerns about that, that's another good time to give us a call. Okay. All right. See, I told you it would be quick and painless. Again, my name is Maria Bloyer, and I hope this was helpful for you. AJE, again, is the District of Columbia's federally designated Parent Training and Information Center. We are still working during the pandemic, have been the whole time, haven't stopped. And the number at the office is 202-678-8060. And I personally am at extension 213, but we have an advocate of the day who's able to pick up the phone whenever you call. And I look forward to connecting with you. I will drop some links and information in the comments. And otherwise, I hope you guys have a great evening. And thank you very, very much for joining me tonight. Take care.